Hey everyone, welcome to the crew. I'm Silo Agenda, and this is The History of the World. Last time we saw the emergence of human civilization in earnest, centered around Mesopotamia, more specifically Uruk, Egypt, and China. We left off in 3300 BCE, where we were seeing the emergence of proper writing, an event which may transform this young human civilization. Now, up to this point, the civilizations of the world have been using writing systems. These consist mainly of ideograms or pictograms, images and symbols which convey a meaning independent of an actual written language, as you see in many modern signs, for example. But these have been getting more and more complex and numerous over time. They've been inventing more signs for more purposes, and now they've reached the critical mass where they have become a true writing system. This is coming to be in Mesopotamia at the moment, and it's called proto-cuneiform. Egypt is a little bit behind. Their system is called hieroglyphics, or proto-hieroglyphics. It's using some ideas borrowed from Mesopotamia, probably, if we're honest, but they're just a few decades behind on it. They're coming soon. Now, at the moment, they're using this system mainly for administrative purposes. They're accounting for stores of barley and grain and alcohol. They're recording transactions, and so on. Nobody's really using this for less utilitarian purposes so far. It's more like record keeping, but maybe in future. And of even more immediate import to the world, some enterprising smiths have accidentally melted down some copper ore which was contaminated with arsenic. Now, that sounds bad, and it's not the first time. Natural copper ores often have a high arsenic content. The difference is this time, they didn't die during the process from the fumes, and they realized that the resulting ore produces a metal which is actually quite a lot more durable than copper. Now, everyone in the world up to now has used copper, but this metal, it's a lot tougher than copper, and it actually melts more easily, which is a good thing because it's kind of hard to fully melt copper. It's malleable enough to be hammered into shapes even cold, but not as perfect as if you could melt it into a cast. But if you alloy it with arsenic, that is, mix it with arsenic, you can melt the resulting metal into a cast, a shape, and that'll let you produce all kinds of shapes a lot more easily. Now, they call this metal bronze, and they're starting to make it for the elites in Uruk. It's pretty expensive, in part because of partially because you need copper that's contaminated with arsenic, or you need arsenic to mix in at least. And then secondly, because the fumes that are put off when they melt the arsenic ores for mixing are extremely unhealthy, to say the least. It seems that rapidly, we have a stereotype developing of smiths limping, and that's because of the nervous system damage they're sustaining from the arsenic fumes. But dang, this bronze is a nice metal, probably it's worth it. Now, obviously the smiths realize this arsenic's not so great. All you have to do is take one whiff of the fumes and pass out and die you don't die immediately, but it's very bad for you. So it doesn't take much to realize that this is kind of bad for you. So they're on the lookout for something a little less dangerous that they can maybe mix into their copper that'll get a similar result. Hopefully they find it, because this bronze is a great metal, but it's being held back a little by being insanely poisonous to produce. Now, in China, we have another culture emerging along the Yangtze River, supplementing the Yangshao culture on the Yellow River. Now, in China, we have another culture emerging along the Yangtze River, supplementing the Yangshao culture on the Yellow River. This is called the Liangzhu culture. It's pretty advanced. They're probably borrowing from their northern neighbors. They have irrigation systems. They rely on rice cultivation for a lot of their food. Like the Yangshao on the Yellow River, they're not as advanced as Mesopotamia, probably not as much as Egypt either. They don't have any writing system to speak of, but it's still a pretty notable emerging civilization. They have some pretty significant stratification. They bury their wealthy dead with jade, silk, ivory, and lacquer. Things like this. Wood later addition, but the thing on top is a jade bee. The poor just get pottery, so we can tell that they have some levels to their society. They're coming along in development. And they have at least one large city of their own near the coast, although details are a bit scarce from that portion of the world. And the river civilizations really are starting to spread at quite a rate now. Actually, a fifth such civilization has popped up along the Indus River Valley. They grow peas, dates, sesame seeds, cotton. They've domesticated the water buffalo, and they probably have a few crops they've imported from Mesopotamia. It's still early days. We're talking mostly about small villages here. They definitely don't have the sophistication of the Fertile Crescent. But this brings the counter up to 5 significant river valley civilizations in the world. On the Nile, on the Tigris and Euphrates, on the Indus, on the Yangtze, and on the Yellow River. And even just around them in general, beyond them, things are getting more complex. They're borrowing ideas from these young developing civilizations. 3200 BCE. Bear with us on this one. We're getting our news from a couple of proto-hieroglyphs on a tomb wall, but I am hearing that a scorpion has unified Upper Egypt. Do I have that right? Okay, apparently it's a fellow named Scorpion, or possibly he uses the scorpion as his symbol. We're going to go ahead and use it as his name for lack of other evidence. So this Scorpion, the first, has apparently unified Upper Egypt under his rule. That would be the part upstream away from the Mediterranean on the Upper Nile. This is all a bit hazy. There's not a lot of hard evidence coming to us on this, but it does seem pretty clear that the Egyptian civilization is becoming more organized and stratified at a pretty high rate. And a lot of the various villages and towns are paying tribute to this scorpion now. Sort of spoilers, because we're still covering a century here, but in short order, Scorpion is followed by Irihor, Ka, and then Scorpion II. I can say little about all of them, except they appear in early serics, or royal name markings, on various objects found in ancient tombs. And most likely this dynasty is now ruling Upper Egypt from Hierakonpolis, possibly as far north already as Memphis, which is basically where the Nile River Delta starts. Now, Irihor II in this line is also, so far as I can tell, the earliest non-mythological person for whom we have an actual name. So that's quite a development in itself. This probably actually happened a while ago, but I can now confirm with certainty that wheels have spread well into throughout Europe, away from the original hubs of civilization, owing to this one, which someone has fished out of a swamp in south-central Europe and preserved as evidence for us. Thank you, ancient swamp dwellers. Now, in a pretty momentous bit of progress from my perspective, considering I am the Sea Lord after all, we can confirm the Egyptians and Mesopotamians have both figured out how to rig sails onto their existing reed boats. These are woven from reeds. The Egyptians use mostly their very well-suited papyrus reed. Durability and seaworthiness of reed ships are not the best, but better than you would expect, honestly. Much later, people have attempted transoceanic voyages and things using them, which is slightly crazy, but on rivers, these reed boats actually work out pretty well. The sails now are a new. They've actually had reed boats for quite a while, but these sails are probably a new addition about now, and they help out a lot with the process of shipping goods back upriver. Obviously, sending them down doesn't require a very sophisticated boat at all, just a basic raft. But with sails, that makes it a lot easier under the right conditions to go back upriver. Doesn't replace oaring, really, but supplements it. Rowing, I mean. But now, these boats are pretty easy to make, actually. All the civilizations at this point, and even non-civilizations, can make cloth from hemp or cotton. And in many cases, the boat sails are actually just made out of more woven reeds anyway, but cloth sails are very possible. Now, these are just simple things. Single sails, short central masts. They're not anything spectacular, although some boats are larger than others for sure at this time. The Egyptians are already experimenting with some pretty big river barges. 3100 BCE. The successor of Scorpion II, who is called Narmer, that's his Horus name, his royal fancy name, or Menes, probably his personal name. Well, he seems to have managed to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, this palette suggests that he did it by bonking that guy on the head with a club or a mace. It's pretty likely, actually, that he managed to do it through marriage to a Lower Egyptian princess, Neithotep, who, incidentally, is the first woman whose name is preserved to us. But we can't rule out that a military campaign was involved. Information is still pretty scarce, and any marriage probably did involve a backdrop of Narmer's military strength being used as the stick in the arrangement. However it happened, Egypt is now apparently united under one ruler from pretty well up the Nile all the way down to the delta on the Mediterranean. We will call this Narmer the founder of the First Dynasty. Surely also the last dynasty, not first of 30 or so. Now, Narmer has not just unified Egypt, he's also expanded his influence into Canaan to the north, a land viewers might call the Levant or Palestine. This is probably a natural consequence of the emergence of what we have to say is almost certainly the greatest military power of this time. Perhaps not. It's very, very hard to judge the relative strength of Uruk and Egypt at this point. Uruk surely has a larger city than anything in Egypt, but Egypt is absolutely now unified and surely one of the very greatest powers in the world. And so trade with the less developed and unified regions around them almost has to be dominated by the unified Egyptians, a cultural weight also. But there's probably still more people in Mesopotamia as a whole. Just a shame nobody has yet heard of the concept of the census. Now, Narmer moves his capital to Memphis at the head of the Nile Delta. His spiritual center remains in Abydos, where he and his predecessors have built their mastabas, which are flat-roofed sort of half pyramids. These mimic the layout of large houses for the dead to inhabit upon their passing, and it's where the whole First Dynasty will be buried. That's their necropolis. More detail on this, probably there will be a special on ancient Egyptian culture. Now, on the northern fringes of Europe, we are seeing some vague news that the locals are building an enormous monument, which with absolutely no justification I will call Stonehenge, although it currently contains no stones. Instead, it's a very large circular ditch and an earth bank and possibly some timber structures or posts on top of it. They seem to be using this for ritual burials, but rumor has it they have a long-term plan in the next 1,000 years or so to add some giant standing stones, so I've preemptively given it the name. In the Alps, a middle-aged man is shot with an arrow and dies high in the mountains. He's a shepherd, perhaps a smith. He has an axe that's 99.7% pure copper. He has a stone knife, he has a yew longbow, various other tools. His clothes are made of bear skin, deer skin, and sheepskin leather. He's extensively tattooed. He's recently been eating bread, ibex, red deer, and chamois meat. All of this would be quite unexceptional. This happens many times a day, quite irrelevant to our story, except for the odd fact that shortly after he dies, a snowstorm, his body is buried in some means under the snow and ice, and spoilers, it's going to stay buried for over 5,000 years until the ice melts and his almost perfectly preserved body is discovered and studied in the future. Those people in the future will name this man Otzi, and he will be an invaluable resource as a snapshot into the life of man of this time. He's about our best bit of sort of confirmed archaeological information as to exactly what kind of food this person would be eating, tools he would have, and so on. Here and now it means little, though. His death is not exceptional by the standards of this moment in 3100 BCE. Now, also by this time, monument building's really starting to pick up. The Neolithic residents of Ireland have built an enormous mound at Newgrange. It's a giant earth circle with a passage leading into a tomb inside, and the front of it actually has this very large white quartz facade which they've dug up and imported from other parts of Ireland, and they've aligned the whole thing such that the sunrise on the winter solstice floods the burial chamber with light through a hole right above the door. Now, aside from being a pretty monumental undertaking labor-wise, this means that the people have really started to acquire an impressive knowledge of astronomical cycles already. This is very far flung from the heart of civilization, but they obviously can calculate not just basic solar and lunar cycles, but detailed calculations of the solstices and the angles needed, and it's pretty clever stuff, really. Especially for people who don't have a written language particularly yet, so they're doing quite well for themselves. Humanity's mastery of water is also moving at quite a rate. The people of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians as we might call them at this point, are constantly improving their irrigation and water control systems on the Euphrates and Tigris. They haven't dammed the rivers themselves entirely, at least not probably, but they do have quite a few significant canals and offshoots, and those canals are often controlled with dams and gates for the entrances. They have extensive levee systems for flood control. And one of our best examples for this is actually a recent case in the village of Jawa, Jordan. Not inhabited for long, probably only by a migratory group for a couple of years, but this site is actually in the Black Desert of Jordan, which is, well, a very barren desert, not suitable for life really at all. However, they manage in quite a short time to build a brick and mortar reservoir dam. So, okay, the only time it rains here is during winter floods for a couple of weeks, and then nothing for the rest of the year. So they need a way to maintain water. They managed to build a brick and mortar reservoir dam to block a nearby wadi, along with several smaller deflection dams to divert water from the floods into nearby low areas and natural caves, to store it all for the dry season. Now, the reservoir dam probably broke and failed. That might be part of why they had to move on, but it's quite an undertaking for what's not even a particularly enormous group, maybe a few hundred people or so. Now, we have a general scarcity of information still on this. Frankly, most of it is not well preserved still at this point. But we can say with certainty that human control of nature is coming along quite nicely. Now, over in Americas, the people are not as advanced as the hubs of civilization in the Eastern Hemisphere, but they are developing at their own rate, and They are now building their own adobe structures, that's mud brick, essentially, which definitely suggests at least scattered permanent residences, although they don't have as many or as excellent useful livestock and crops as the Mesopotamian package, probably. Maize is pretty excellent, but especially in terms of useful farm animals, they're perhaps lagging a bit. Not their fault, of course, but such is how it is. Speaking of Uruk, though, it in 3100 BCE is continuing to grow at quite a rate, and it is really the marvel of the world. Its residents have built a 20-meter, 65-foot ziggurat at its center, the Anu ziggurat, which is topped by the so-called White Temple. Now, they've coated the exterior of this temple in gypsum, so it shines a reflective white in the sun. It's easily the highest point in the city and for miles around. So, it's not exactly a skyscraper, of course. It's, in the literal sense, only about, 4 modern stories or something like that. But at this stage, it's one of the biggest structures in the world, and kind of a literal shining beacon at the heart of civilization, if you want to think of it in a poetic kind of way. They have also, on a more practical note, now begun construction on this tremendous wall around the city. Now, this is 9 kilometers of 12 to 15 meter high mud brick wall. A huge project, actually. Much more material than the temple. I'm not exactly clear on why the people of Uruk are taking such unprecedented measures for their defense at this point, as they are still the dominant city of the region, but it may just be a matter of prestige, but it also may just be that the other cities in Mesopotamia are starting to move along a bit now, definitely smaller than Uruk, but perhaps also a bit jealous because of that. Some of those cities are probably Uruk's colonies. All of them are definitely influenced by Uruk to a great extent, but they're beginning to grow in their own right, and you can see why the people of Uruk might be a little concerned that they might actually be threatened on their home turf for the first time in centuries, really. 3000 BCE. It's likely that, hypothetically speaking, is... Alright. Drop the facade for a second. It's right about now, 5,000 years ago, speaking in the present, that the world's oldest organism is born. In the form of either a bristlecone pine in what we now know as California, or possibly a yew somewhere in Britain. Either way, that tree is still alive in the present day 2024. Although we don't know for a certainty exactly which tree is. The yews actually rot out and make it hard to take core samples, and the pines, first of all, we haven't sampled all of them, and second of all, if we do know which one it is, the National Park Service keeps it hidden. But anyway, back in character, things are continuing to move along pretty nicely in Europe, or in Egypt, that is. The first dynasty is actually thriving as of 3000. Unlike some unifications, the death of Narmer has not undone all of his achievements. Instead, possibly after a brief regency by his bride Neithotep, he's been succeeded by his son Hora-Aha. Hora-Aha apparently focused on internal consolidation and religious activities, and Egyptian involvement in Canaan fell off a bit. He wed Benerep and possibly also Kentop, who was probably the mother of his heir Dier. All of this, again, we're gleaning basically from inscriptions on tomb walls, so it's not the most detailed sources of information. Now, on his death, he is succeeded by Dier, who is buried, and Hora-Ha is buried next to Narmer at Abydos. Dier is probably quite young when he takes the throne, and it's likely that his grandmother Neithotep actually has a regency at this time. So, although she doesn't necessarily rule in her own right, probably, um, this is still a pretty definite case of a likely essentially a female ruler of one of these ancient civilizations, even at this early date. It actually probably gets more unlikely from here for a good while. But anyway, Dier eventually takes power in his own right and seems to have ruled for something on the order of 40 years or more, which makes sense if he took the throne at like 10 or so. Obviously, we're not clear on that, but believable. He tours his realm, he campaigns against the residents of the Sinai, he probably takes at least 4 wives, including Noxneith, Herneith, Seshet Maka, and Penabui. And also, interestingly, he's probably the first pharaoh of Egypt to arrange for a brother-sister marriage between his heir Jet and his daughter Merneith. I'm not clear myself on exactly why he would have done this, but it's probably because the divinity cult around the pharaoh is really beginning to mature now. He's kind of not just a king, but a god king, and so his bloodline is special. Whether he necessarily believes it himself or it's just a pragmatic move, hard to say, but that seems to be what the situation is here. And as of now, 3000 BCE, Dier is still sitting the throne. His heir is Jet, married to his sister Merneith, and we'll see when he takes power. Now, all politics aside, stabilization of the first dynasty, all that, sure, the real critical development in Egypt is that they have managed to domesticate the camel. And I have no doubt that these creatures will benefit human civilization greatly. Somehow. Probably by spitting on people. Okay. The camel is a very useful beast of burden in the desert. They have great desert survival abilities, much better than a horse. Also, horses haven't really made it to Egypt yet at this date anyway. Not in any numbers, but outside of the desert, the camel is quite unlikely to ever surpass the ox or the horse, etc. One would think, considering their disadvantage, the desert adaptations that make them so great in the desert make them not so great outside of the desert. Plus, their temperament is not as ideal as some other beasts of burden, shall we say. Now, aside from that, bronze coming along quite nicely, thanks in part to the fact that some of those smiths have finally found an alternative to arsenic. I say finally, remember it's been 300, 400 years or so. That alternative? Tin. Tin works a lot better than arsenic overall. The properties of the resulting bronze are not that different. It's a bit easier to control the alloying process if you use tin and therefore to cast the bronze afterwards, but frankly the major difference is that the tin fumes aren't insanely toxic. There is just one problem. Nobody can find any tin. We found a bit of tin, cassiterite, tin oxide, in riverbanks in Mesopotamia, which is what they used for the experiments that led to this copper-tin alloy that we're calling bronze. But no big concentration, no mine, industrial-sized mine for tin. And so as a result, unfortunately, although they now know there is a better alternative, most smiths are forced to stick with the arsenic process for the time being for most material, pretty much supplemented by whatever tin they can find. In an ideal world, they would just use the tin they could find, but frankly, demand is through the roof. Bronze is very durable, easy to make into complex shapes. Now, as I've mentioned, you can hammer copper into shape, especially if you heat it a little, but not necessarily as easy as casting, especially if you're going to do some sort of mass production, not mass production, but pseudo-mass production sort of thing. So yeah, demand is through the roof. Not just in Uruk, but at this point, bronze is spreading through the whole Fertile Crescent and beyond. Persia, Anatolia, even Greece clamoring for the metal. Speaking of which, civilization has continued to spread steadily out from the original hubs. Obviously, there's no other great city of Uruk and her children, there's no other Nile River and Egypt, but there are towns and villages appearing as far out as well into the Persian steppes, throughout Anatolia, in Greece, in the Cyclades and Crete. Not just small pre agricultural villages or tribes, but settled agricultural villages. And imported bronze is starting to appear among the villages there. Now, these are they don't really hold a candle to the river civilizations yet, but the idea of civilization is there now, and they're growing. And so, well, we pass the millennium into the 2000s BCE. The world is continuing to develop, slowly by the standards of what is still a very far off future, but I can't emphasize enough, much faster than at any previous time in history. Let's not forget it took tens of thousands of years for humans to learn how to do any sort of agriculture, and something like 6,000 or so between when we first started planting plants on purpose to when we were actually able to settle. And in just the 1,000 years since then, we've made quite a bit of progress. There are now at least 5 major river civilizations. Besides that, the secrets of agriculture, metalworking, and others are spreading pretty widely across the areas around Samaria and Egypt in particular. Speaking of which, Egypt has now unified under a pharaoh, surely, almost certainly the single largest state in the world, snaking down the Nile from the Mediterranean quite a way. Sumeria, with its 2 rivers, is still probably got a larger population and a bit more in the way of general advancement. It's still quite dominated by the great city of Uruk, with its walls, its population of 40,000 or more, its shining white temple. Overall, it's been an unprecedented millennia. Human civilization is off the ground and spreading like wildfire. I mean, if this wildfire took centuries per couple hundred kilometers, it's still a heck of a lot faster than any previous fire. Now, what wonders will the new millennium bring? Well, remember to subscribe and join us next time to find out.